Thousands of tiny, golden dust motes drifted lazily within a single, solid shaft of amber sunlight that pierced through the workshop window. They moved in a slow, aimless dance, swirling in invisible eddies that remained entirely undisturbed by the restless currents of air outside the heavy walls. The air in the room was thick and comforting, smelling deeply of aged timber and the sweet, mellow scent of resin that had long since settled into every corner. A fine, pale layer of cedar sawdust covered the wide floorboards, softening the sound of every slow, deliberate footstep until the room itself felt wrapped in a blanket of quiet. Resting upon the heavy, scarred workbench, a steel chisel lay in quiet repose next to a single, curled ribbon of wood shaving, a delicate, translucent spiral that looked like a fallen autumn leaf. The metal of the tool was dull and cool against the skin, while the wood of its handle felt smooth and warm, holding the lingering ghost of a craftsman's steady grip. There was no urgency here, no pressure to perform or hasten the day. The tall clock on the wall ticked with a steady, hypnotic rhythm, though its hands seemed to move with such immense patience that they only advanced in the moments when no one was looking. This silence was not an absence of sound, but a heavy, peaceful weight, filled with the memory of work already perfected and the gentle, soothing promise of tasks that could wait quite happily until the arrival of tomorrow. In the expansive, wind-swept yards of Astoria, New York, the stacks of timber sat in silent, monumental rows under the vast, open sky. This was the mid-20th century, an era where time seemed to move with a different weight, and patience was an essential, unhurried requirement of the craft. The wood was spruce, a material of quiet strength and potential. It had once stood tall in distant northern forests, breathing the thin mountain air, before being carried across the land by slow-moving rivers and the rhythmic pulse of rail lines. Now it rested. The drying yard was more than a simple storage space. It was a deliberate grid of patience. Workers clad in heavy, coarse canvas aprons moved with measured steps between the towering stacks. They did not rush their work. They moved with a steady grace, checking the precise spacing between each individual plank to ensure that the living air could weave its way freely through the narrow gaps. The wind from the East River carried a faint, briny hint of salt, but here, within the heart of the yard, the air was dominated by the sharp, clean aroma of pine sap. The wood needed to sleep and settle. For 2 full years, the planks remained in the yard, exposed to the slow turning of the seasons. They weathered the grey rains of November that slicked the wood and the heavy, humid heat of July that shimmered above the stacks. This was the seasoning process, a slow and silent transition as old as craftsmanship itself. It was a gentle, invisible evaporation. The moisture held deep within the cellular structure of the tree began to leave, molecule by molecule, rising into the air as a ghostly, unseen vapor. Inside the drying kilns, the air was warmer, thick with a dry, enveloping heat, and the humidity was controlled with obsessive, quiet precision. A worker walked down the narrow, shadowed aisle between the lumber stacks. He reached out and placed a steady hand on the rough, textured surface of a spruce plank. It felt remarkably dry to the touch, lighter and more buoyant than it had been a year ago, as if it were losing its earthly gravity. The water was gone, leaving behind only the golden, crystallized resin and the strong, hollow veins of the timber. It was becoming a vessel for sound, a chamber waiting for a voice. The kiln hummed a low, steady note, a mechanical lullaby for the sleeping forest. Inside the factory proper, the atmosphere shifted as the light transformed into something more luminous and concentrated. It was significantly brighter here, filtering through high, industrial-paned windows to cast long, rectangular pools of gold onto the polished maple floors. This was the quiet, specialized domain of the soundboard department. The air was filled with a much finer dust than in the other rooms, a silken powder that hung perfectly suspended in the warm shafts of the afternoon sun. Each mote of sawdust seemed to dance in slow motion, drifting lazily through the warmth like microscopic stars. A craftsman stood at a large, heavy workbench that had seen decades of such labor. Before him lay the joined planks of premium Sitka spruce, their grains aligned with mathematical precision. The wood was pale and cream-colored, its surface waiting to be shaped into the heart of an instrument. He held a hand plane in his weathered hands, a tool made of dark iron and polished wood with a blade honed to a microscopic edge. With a steady, deliberate motion, he pushed the plane across the expansive surface of the soundboard. SHHHHK. The sound was rhythmic and soft, a gentle exhalation in the quiet workshop. It was a sound of progress, measured and peaceful. A thin, translucent curl of wood rose gracefully from the blade, spiraling upward like a delicate ribbon, before it drifted downward to settle softly upon the floor. The craftsman was beginning the meticulous process of tapering the board. It was not meant to be a simple, flat piece of wood. It needed to remain thicker in the center and grow thinner as it reached the outer edges. This careful reduction of mass created the crown, a gentle, almost imperceptible dome that would one day hold the immense tension of the steel strings. He paused in his rhythm to run his fingers slowly over the spruce surface. He was not looking for imperfections with his eyes, but with the sensitive nerves in his fingertips. The wood was becoming as smooth as polished glass, feeling remarkably warm from the natural friction of the blade. He picked up a small, felt-tipped mallet and gave the center of the board a light, expert tap. A low wooden thump resonated through the room, a deep sound that carried a quiet promise of the music yet to come. He nodded once, his face a mask of calm focus, then picked up the plane to continue the slow, hypnotic reduction of the grain, one translucent shaving at a time. The atmosphere shifted, drifting away from the aroma of sawdust and into the sharp, metallic scent of heated tin. This was a basement in Trumansburg, New York, a sanctuary tucked away from the world. The year was 1964, and while the world outside was rushing forward with noise, down here, time seemed to slow to the pace of a steady breath. The walls were lined with sturdy pegboards and shelves, crowded with jars of tiny components and coils of copper wire. Robert Moog sat perfectly still, hunched over a heavy workbench. The lighting was soft and dim, a pool of amber light focused entirely on the small circuit board held firmly in the jaws of a metal vise. Beside him, a soldering iron rested in its spiral holder, sending a wisp of grey smoke curling toward the ceiling. The smell was acrid yet sweet, the scent of melting rosin. He reached out and picked up the iron, feeling its familiar weight. The tip glowed with a soft, dull orange heat. With a steady hand, he touched the hot tip to a joint on the board, feeding a thin, silver wire of solder into the warmth. The metal transformed instantly, turning into a bead of liquid silver that flowed smoothly around the leg of a transistor. When he lifted the iron, the liquid froze solid, the bright shine dulling into a matte gray. These were the first oscillators. There were no wooden hammers here, no vibrating strings, no parts that the eye could see moving. There was only the invisible, pulsing flow of electricity. Moog reached for a wire, connecting the circuit to a small speaker. His fingers found a black Bakelite knob, its surface cool and smooth. He began to turn it slowly. A low, resonant hum filled the room, a sound that felt more like a presence than a noise. It was not the timbre of a piano or a violin. It was the sound of raw voltage. As he turned the knob to the right, the pitch rose, a steady and pure wave. On the workbench, the green line of an oscilloscope screen danced, tracing the shape of the sound in a glowing phosphor trail. It was a warm, organic sound, lacking the sharp edges of the digital world. It hummed like a large insect, vibrating the air in the small, cluttered basement. Time moved forward in the world outside, but the atmosphere within the electronic workshop remained remarkably consistent, a sanctuary of stillness and steady focus. In a studio decades later, the walls were lined with towering banks of machines, their complex faces looking out into the dim space like silent sentinels. The room was dark, lit only by the gentle constellations of small LED lights that glowed in soft, steady shades of red, amber, and green. These tiny stars cast a faint, colorful haze over the equipment, reflecting softly off the polished surfaces and the dark, quiet floor. A musician stood before a wall of modular synthesizers, his presence calm and deliberate as he surveyed the landscape of knobs and switches. Thick black cables draped across the front of the panels like heavy, rubbery vines, their surfaces cool to the touch in the conditioned air. The air conditioner hummed in the background with a low, constant vibration, creating a soft white noise floor that anchored the room. The musician reached out and guided a patch cable toward a jack labeled filter cutoff. There was a satisfying, tactile mechanical click as the plug seated home, the metal components meeting to complete a silent circuit. He turned a large, smooth dial with infinite patience, feeling the subtle resistance of the dial beneath his fingertips. As the dial rotated, the sound in the room changed in a slow, sweeping arc of frequency. It shifted from a bright, buzzing sawtooth wave to a muffled, underwater throb that was deep, resonant, and calm. He adjusted the attack envelope with a tiny, precise movement. Now, the sound did not begin with a sudden strike. Instead, it swelled up slowly, emerging from the silence like a soft sunrise. He pressed a single key and held it, the plastic feeling smooth and cool under his finger. The note sustained, hanging in the air without decaying, a pure frequency that refused to fade. Unlike a piano string that eventually stops vibrating, this sound could go on forever, sustained by the invisible current of electricity flowing through the wires. The room was bathed in the wide wash of synthesized texture. It was a cocoon of frequency, wrapping around the listener, holding them in a gentle suspension of artificial sound. The timeline receded, falling back through the centuries, drifting until it settled 300 years ago on the golden, sun-drenched plains of Lombardy. The sun beat down with a steady and relentless warmth on the ancient, weathered cobblestones of Cremona, Italy, creating a shimmering haze over the quiet streets. Inside the workshop of Antonio Stradivari, this intense summer heat was not a burden, but a welcome guest. It was the invisible hand that helped the delicate layers of varnish dry and settle deeply into the fine grain of the wood. The room smelled intensely of a beautiful marriage between chemistry and nature, a comforting scent of history and craft, of aged wood and drying oils. There were jars of translucent gum arabic, their glass surfaces dusted with time, bottles of golden linseed oil, and sacks of crushed minerals holding secret colors pulled from the earth. The master stood by a sturdy table near the open window, where the afternoon light made the floating dust motes dance like tiny, silent stars. He held a heavy pestle and a cool, smooth stone mortar in his calloused hands. Inside the bowl, he ground a mixture of rare resins, the sound a steady, rhythmic clack-clack grind that was the slow heartbeat of the afternoon. He added a single, viscous drop of oil. Under his steady hand, the powder turned into a thick, shimmering, golden paste. He worked it slowly, ensuring there were no lumps, only a perfect, velvet consistency. A violin hung by its slender neck from a wire stretched across the span of the room. The wood was pale and quiet, naked maple and spruce waiting for its voice. Stradivari dipped a soft brush into the varnish. The bristles, made of fine animal hair, were soft against the wood. He applied the first coat with a gentle, patient touch. The liquid went on smooth and sticky, darkening the wood instantly and bringing out the tiger-stripe figure of the maple back, making the grain ripple like water. He painted with long, even meditative strokes. He did not rush. The varnish had to be thin, a mere whisper, too thick, and it would dampen the vibration of the music. Too thin, and it would not protect the wood through the centuries. He hung the instrument back on the wire. A single drip formed at the bottom curve, and he caught it with the delicate tip of the brush. The violin turned slowly in the warm air, drying, hardening, and sealing the sound inside. The daily rhythm of the Cremona workshop was defined by a silence so profound. It seemed to have its own weight, a quiet that breathed with the ancient stone walls. The apprentices arrived long before the first golden hints of dawn, moving like gentle shadows through the cool, dim air. Their first task was a ritual of tidying. They took up straw brooms, the dried stalks crackling, and swept the floors to gather the fragrant curls of spruce and maple shavings from the previous day. The sound of the broom on the cool stone was a soft, rhythmic scratching, a repetitive hush that was both hypnotic and calming. By mid-morning, as the sun began to warm the rafters, the only sounds were the songs of the tools. A sharp gouge bit into a dense block of seasoned maple with a low, satisfying crunch. A steel scraper moved over the curve of a cello scroll, producing a sound like a long, drawn-out sigh as it smoothed the wood to a silk-like texture. The apprentices did not speak. They communicated through subtle nods or the simple tilt of a head, their concentration so absolute that the air itself felt heavy with focus. Stradivari sat at his bench, his hands steady as he carved a bridge. The piece of wood was incredibly tiny, no larger than a matchbox, yet it held the future of the instrument's voice. He held a knife with a blade as thin and delicate as a leaf, its steel edge polished to a mirror shine. With infinite patience, he carved the feet of the bridge, thinning the wood to fit the arch of the violin's belly with absolute precision. It had to be a perfect, airtight fit, a seamless meeting of two surfaces. The light moved lazily across the room as the sun tracked its path over the roof, casting long, amber shadows across the workbench. The smell of hide glue, kept warm in a copper pot over a small charcoal brazier, grew stronger. It was a rich, animal scent, heavy, pervasive, and ancient. The workshop felt like a library, a place where knowledge was stored not in books, but in the muscle memory of tired hands and the intricate grain of the wood. The world outside the heavy door, the market, the carriages, and the shouting vendors, felt miles away, forgotten in the stillness. In the damp, grey corridors of London in the 1960s, a city veiled in mist, The BBC Radiophonic Workshop operated out of a converted skating rink in Maida Vale. The building, once a grand skating rink, now hummed with a quiet technological energy. The acoustic treatment on the walls was composed of thick, porous tiles designed to swallow sound, deadening the air until the room felt small and cocooned. The air was still and cool, smelling faintly of warm vacuum tubes and the sharp scent of ozone. The room was dominated by large, grey reel-to-reel tape machines. The spools spun with a hypnotic, mesmerizing quality. Whir-click, whir-click. The magnetic tape was a deep, chocolate brown and polished to a mirror-like shine, catching the soft glow of the indicator lamps as it wound past. An engineer stood at a heavy metal splicing block, her posture one of meditative concentration. She pulled a length of tape from the supply spool, the material feeling thin between her fingers. She marked a spot with a white grease pencil, the soft wax leaving a distinct, pale mark. This was where the sound began. She laid the tape into the narrow metal groove of the block. She picked up a fresh razor blade. With a precise, vertical motion, she sliced through the tape with a soft, sliding sound. The excess fell to the floor in a weightless spiral, joining a tangle of discarded brown ribbons. She took a small piece of white adhesive tape, its surface tacky and bright, and joined the two ends of the magnetic tape together with a surgeon's touch. This was the creation of a loop. She threaded the tape back through the machine, creating a circle that would play forever in a perfect cycle. She pressed the play button. The machine engaged with a deep, resonant clunk. The tape moved over the playback head. A rhythmic, metallic beat began to pulse through the speakers. It repeated every 2 seconds. The engineer watched the splice go round and round, a brief white flash marking the heartbeat of the machine and the unhurried passage of time. The alchemy of the radiophonic workshop was not concerned with the pursuit of gold, but rather with the delicate and patient manipulation of time itself. Inside the hushed and heavy confines of a small isolation room, a simple metal lampshade hung suspended from a sturdy, matte black microphone stand, its surface catching the dim, amber light of the studio. The air in the room was perfectly still and cool, smelling faintly of warm vacuum tubes, the metallic tang of solder, and the dry, porous scent of acoustic foam. An engineer held a single drumstick with a light touch, feeling the smooth, polished grain of the wood against the pads of his fingers. He moved his arm in a slow, graceful arc, striking the cold, brushed metal with a focused and quiet precision. Ting! The sound was sharp and crystalline, a bright, singing spark of energy that rippled through the quiet air and hung there for a heartbeat, shimmering. But the recording was not yet finished. It was merely the raw material for a deeper transformation. The engineer moved to the tape machine, his fingers touching the cool, dark surface of the magnetic ribbon as he threaded it carefully through the polished silver guides and around the heavy rollers. He took the recording of that single strike and began to slow the playback speed, turning the dials with infinite, steady care. He played the tape at half speed. Doo-wong. The sound transformed instantly, losing its sharp edges and becoming deeper, heavier, and more resonant, vibrating with a physical weight that seemed to settle comfortably in the listener's chest. He slowed the machine down once again, watching the heavy reels turn in their rhythmic, hypnotic dance, slower and slower. Now the sharp, percussive strike of the wood against the metal vanished completely, dissolving into the background. What remained was a low, rolling texture, a sound that felt like a great, ancient bell tolling slowly deep beneath the surface of a dark and silent ocean. He fed this subterranean sound into the echo chamber, a secret, empty room located in the cool, subterranean darkness of the basement. There, the walls were lined with cold, white ceramic tiles that shimmered under the dim light. The sound emerged from a speaker at one end and bounced gracefully off the hard, reflective surfaces, gaining a ghostly, ethereal tail of reverb that lingered in the air like a faint, silver mist. When the sound finally returned through the wires to the speakers in the control room, it no longer possessed any trace of its humble origin. It no longer sounded like a lampshade. It sounded like the vast, cold atmosphere of a distant, nameless planet drifting through the infinite silence of space. The engineer sat back in his worn leather chair, his body relaxing as he listened to the slow, steady decay of the sound. He watched the tape spin until the tone eventually faded into the soft, natural noise of the magnetic grain, a gentle, rhythmic hiss that sounded exactly like the comforting sound of soft rain falling on a quiet roof in the middle of the night. Inside the vast, cavernous workshop of Aristide Cavaillé-Coll in 19th century Paris, the air itself seemed to vibrate with the sheer, monumental scale of sound production. This was a cathedral of industry where they built organs, grand, architectural wonders that were far too large to be held in a human hand. These were instruments you could enter, vast landscapes of timber and metal that you could walk inside, feeling the weight of the silence before the music began. The foundry floor was heavy with a thick, pervasive heat that radiated from the glowing hearths. Workers stood with steady feet over deep crucibles filled with a molten alloy, a precise, ancestral blend of tin and lead. The liquid metal shimmered with a deceptive silver brilliance, moving within the pots like liquid mercury, thick and viscous, and impossibly bright against the dark soot of the floor. A worker tipped the heavy ladle with a slow, practiced grace, pouring the glowing liquid onto a long, sturdy table that had been carefully covered in a layer of smooth, pale linen cloth. The metal spread out across the fabric, a glowing river of heat that slowly began to find its level. With a rhythmic and deliberate motion, he pulled a wooden sled across the molten pool, smoothing the surface and flattening it into a thin, perfectly uniform sheet. As the air touched the metal, it began to cool rapidly, a transformation taking place before his eyes as the silver liquid dulled into a matte grey solid. It was soft and heavy, a tactile weight that felt substantial and grounded. The workers then took these sheets, rolling them with careful hands into perfect cylinders and soldering the long seams with a steady, focused heat. These were the pipes, the lungs of the great organ. Some were delicate and slender, no thicker than a common pencil, while others were gargantuan, with diameters wide enough for a grown man to crawl through, their dark openings looking like the mouths of hidden caves. They stood in long, disciplined rows against the stone walls, resembling a silent forest of metal trunks waiting for the wind. In this part of the workshop, the air was cool and still, providing a sharp, refreshing contrast to the intense heat of the foundry floor. There was a distinct smell of cold metal and the sharp, metallic tang of solder. A voicer, whose ears were tuned to the finest subtleties of vibration, took a finished pipe and placed it gently onto the wooden testing chest. He let air into the foot of the pipe. Hoo-woo. The sound was breathy and flute-like, a soft sigh that drifted through the quiet room. He took a small tool and adjusted the mouth of the pipe by a fraction of a millimeter, a movement almost invisible to the eye. He tried again. The note was clearer, rounder, vibrating with a newfound purity. It was the sound of the wind being tamed, gently forced to sing a specific, resonant pitch. Decades later, nestled deep within the darker, cooler environment of a great, ancient cathedral, the Cavail organ stood in a state of magnificent and heavy silence. It was a machine of immense, quiet complexity, a labyrinth of artistry hidden behind a tall and imposing facade of aged, dark oak and silvery, polished tin. To enter the inner workings of the organ was to step into the very lungs of a great, peaceful beast, a place where time seemed to slow down into a series of rhythmic breaths. Narrow wooden walkways, smoothed by years of careful passage, squeezed between the towering vertical ranks of pipes that reached upward like a metallic forest toward the high shadows of the ceiling. The air inside this hidden, wooden world smelled deeply of oiled leather and dry, fragrant wood, a comforting scent that spoke of centuries of patient craftsmanship and stillness. Beneath the heavy, solid floorboards lay the bellows, massive, patient reservoirs of air made of sturdy wood and soft, supple sheepskin leather. When the motor finally engaged with a low, distant hum, the leather began to expand, stretching and creaking softly with a gentle, rhythmic sigh, like the slow breathing of a giant as it filled with life-giving air. The pressure built up with a steady, quiet force, a held breath waiting for the perfect, infinitesimal moment of its release. A vast, intricate web of thin wooden strips, called trackers, connected the keys at the console to the small valves hidden far below the pipes. It was a mechanical nervous system, delicate and precise, stretching through the dark in perfect alignment. When a key was pressed 30 feet away with a soft, deliberate touch of a finger, a tracker moved in a silent, gliding motion. A valve opened, and the pressurized air rushed with a faint hiss into the base of the pipe. The sound that emerged was deeply and profoundly physical. The low pedal notes were not just heard by the ears. They were felt as a subtle, grounding trembling in the floor, a hum within the massive stone pillars, and a gentle resonance in the chest of anyone standing nearby in the cathedral stillness. It was a thick, enveloping wall of sound, rich with golden harmonics that seemed to glow in the air. The mixture of metal and wood, leather and air, combined to create a vibration that appeared to sustain itself through its own momentum, rolling slowly like a tide through the vast, empty space of the nave, and fading with a lingering, rhythmic grace into the high, shadowy reaches of the vaulted stone ceiling. The tools are laid down now, their weight released from the steady hands that held them with such focus throughout the day. Each handle finds its place on the bench with a soft, final click. The chisel rests on the worn wood, its sharp steel edge gleaming faintly in the waning light, a silent witness to the patience of the craft. The soldering iron cools slowly, the metal tip shifting from a dull heat to a deep, matte charcoal. The jar of varnish is capped, and the sharp scent of resin begins to drift and thin in the corners of the room. The tape machine stops its spinning, the reels coming to a slow and rhythmic halt as the recorded sound settles into the walls. The air within the bellows exhales one last time, the supple leather settling into soft, quiet folds. The workshop is still. The tiny particles of sawdust begin their slow descent, landing softly to cover the footprints left by the day's labor. The light from the window dims, shifting from a warm yellow to a deep, bruised purple, and finally to a soft grey. The objects in the room lose their sharp edges, blending into the velvet shadows that stretch across the floor. There is no more work to be done. The wood rests and the metal cools. The silence returns, absolute and heavy, wrapping the entire room in a thick, invisible blanket of stillness.